Jane Gaines is professor of film here at Columbia University. Previously, she founded and directed the program in film video digital studies at Duke University, and she's won national awards for 2 books. And she has also published articles on intellectual property and early film piracy, as well as documentary film and video. And currently, she is completing Fictioning History's Women Film Pioneers, a project for which she received an Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences Scholar Award.
Thank you, Beth. It's very, very exciting to be here at the first conference on the Makino Collection and to be part of a community of international scholars who will change the course of what we have called cinema history. I'm introducing the 3 panelists together to save time because there's so much material. And perhaps this is just an indication of things to come, because every time someone finds something that could connect to the Makino, the project just balloons. So first, in order of the paper presentation, Professor Weihang Bao, I want to introduce as my colleague and assistant professor here in Chinese film and media in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures, and to anticipate her forthcoming book, manuscript, Dances of Fire, Aesthetic Affect and the Intermediation of Chinese Cinema, 1884, which is very early for cinema beginnings, to 1945, and anticipate, secondly, her project in progress, underway, imagined as she finishes the first, the shadowy theater of Chinese cinema. And these 2 projects she'll be working on in Germany next semester. So after Professor Bao's talk, which she has here on the screen, Podevkin's Fellow Travelers, the Introduction of Montage in China, we will have the second presentation by Professor Ted Hughes, who's Associate Professor of Modern Korean Literature here in East Asian Languages and Literatures. His first book on literature and film in Cold War South Korea is called Freedom's Frontier, and he also has a second book, Cultural History of the Korean War, titled The Remembered War. Now, the third panelist, Professor Hughes will speak on the archive phobia, which for him blocks out the problem of Korean cinema and its particular colonial past and the relation to Japan. The third presentation by Dr. Riko Ikegata is a presentation which will be in Japanese, but Hikari Hari has passed out the English translation. So those of you fluent in Japanese will be able to enjoy her paper on Japanese female director Sakane Tazuko, who was aligned with the Manchurian Film Association, and it's about the archival materials that she used in researching Japanese colonial films. Now, a little more about Dr. Riko Ikegata, who is interesting for us because she has a PhD in literature from the Kawamura Women's University, which she received in 2006. And since she has been adjunct lecturer on the Faculty of Comparative Culture at Atsuma Women's University. This is, of course, for Western scholars, very fascinating that there should be women's universities, so we'll need to hear more about that. I understand this is a perfect project and perfect placement for her, that her dissertation, which was a study of Sakane Tazuko, in particular, has been not only published in Japan, but received a significant, prestigious prize, the now Oyama Prize from the Institute for Women's Studies in Tokyo. So that third paper will be in paper handout form, but also you will hear it in Japanese. So we have just a short response, and then I plan to leave discussion time. So the panelists at that point will come back up, and I hope Hikari can join us to translate questions for Professor Ikegata. Am I doing all Ikegata? Reiko Ikegata. Okay. So to return to Ted Hughes' paper, I wanted to comment on his title, Archive Phobia, which he uses to preface his discussion of Korean cinema and its problematic relation to its colonial master, Japan. And I'm guessing that his archive phobia is a rather sly reference to Jacques Derrida's archive fever, which we all know to be a very strange English translation of the French mal d'archive, which could have been translated to preserve the connotations of disease or malady. So I would begin by asking what could possibly be so malodorous about the Makino Mamoru Collection that attracts us? Or is it that we as scholars are so feverishly driven in our return to such a monumental set of holdings, the largest of its kind in the world? And this, I get this from, I want to take a chance so I have a little more time to thank the organizers, Paul Ander, Jim Chang, Hikari Hari, and Beth Katzloff, who have described the Makino Collection to me, exhibited it to my students, but I have yet to crack its code. So I remark here from the outset that the archive is especially intriguing to scholars who do not have the Japanese language key to it, and thus for whom it comes to stand for the impenetrability of the historical past itself. And to think that it's here in the C.V. Starr Library, just across from the building where I work. So both Dr. Ikegata, who I'm going to call Rico, and Professor Hughes hint that the collection contains buried relics of the Japanese colonial era. Thus, it may help us keep alive the hope that historical archives can be made to give up some of the secrets of the cultures that they guard. Ted refers to more than one missing moment in contemporary Korean history, with particular concern about the 1910 to 45 colonial era of Japanese occupation of Korea. But back to Derrida, who in thinking about finding nothing, seems to comment as well on the portions of historical time missing from official accounts. When he says, although we find nothing in a place, an absence is not nothing, but is rather the space left by what is gone. And I think about this when I think that even and especially when thought to be lost, there's a way in which the not there can become all the more there for us, especially as scholars looking for it. In excavating Sakani Tazuko's Brides of the Continent, or as the translation you have handed out says, Frontier, a 1943 propaganda film, for us, Rico shows us how much was formerly not nothing. An entire war effort based on the import of Japanese brides to as part of the effort to colonize Manchuria, an enormous effort that just vanished. We should single out as well her unflinching analysis of what it meant for a female director to imagine, actually imagine this sort of utopianism, and the images give us this utopian domestic life, and to think of it as also aiding the Japanese imperial project, the very same time serving as a model of historical research, in which she says effectively, or makes us think that we should never assume anything. We should never assume that there were no women, and never assume uncontradictory consciousness in historical subjects. I think I get this from reading her commentary because of the doubleness, the sort of double consciousness of the early propaganda filmmaker, and what I find incredibly useful is just this contradictory notion of the imperial feminist. We never dared call Leni Riefenstahl an imperial feminist. That was a taboo, and you have nailed it. This is a very useful concept. I also, in following Professor Bao's paper, realized that she urges us to never assume that there was no connection between historical subjects, as she demonstrates, showing us that the Chinese left-wing movement was linked closely, inexorably, to the Japanese proletarian film movement in the 1930s. With all of this evidence, no one could ever deny it again. Through these three papers, there is also a fraught question of national cinema, a thread that many of us follow when we try to do comparative world cinema. So the cases of the Korean, Japanese, and Chinese national cinemas buried in the Makino Collection urge us to work through that collection in an attempt to try to define it yet again. But to my mind, the best definition so far has been offered by Chinese scholar Chris Berry, who has written in answer to this question quite simply. National cinema is the cinema made by the nation, whatever that is. That's the end of the quote. So we cannot know what is national cinema until we know what it is that the relatively new political entity, the nation, was. Then again, doesn't the claim to a national cinema, especially in cases like India, Iran, and now we see from Ted's paper this emerging moment, this possibility of a rebirth of a Korean cinema confused with a communist cinema or anti-communist cinema. So all of these moments seem to correspond to political upheaval. But actually, cinema history makes the entire question of the nation defined by its culture more, not less difficult. Something we learn from what Ted Hughes tells us about how Korean culture was Japanese popular culture at the colonial moment. And here's where cinema historians know something that other scholars of 20th century culture may have missed. And that is that to the degree that foreign cinemas became popular motion pictures in the country that imported them is the degree to which they became part of the national culture of the nation that adopted them. And it's impossible to extricate that borrowed culture, sometimes an enforced culture, as it became popular. This is why, for example, for instance, Amsterdam Film Archive preserves and restores so many examples of national cinema other than its own. Because the Dutch, who had a relatively small national film industry, embraced German, American, French cinema, and that is Dutch popular cinema heritage for all intents and purposes. So they are not about to let that go elsewhere. That is preserved in the Netherlands. So from these papers, we see something of the world traffic in film prints. We see this as, during the cinema century, a flow that was quite continual. How it is that motion pictures ended up, however, in FIAF archives, located at the other end of the world from the nation in which they were originally produced, is one of the questions that is absolutely obsessing cinema scholars at this point. Because as the Federation of International Film Archives become, their holdings become available, and the treasures from the FIAF Archives database, which we have here at Columbia, gets used by young scholars, we discover that in the cinema century, prints were constantly in circulation. Both Ted and Rico refer to the recent release of the late colonial Korean imperialization films called Past Unearthed as a DVD series. But the DVD titles, of course, are digital versions of 35mm film prints that would have to have been restored either by archives within which they were originally deposited, or which they have recently been, or to which they have recently been shifted and, as we call it, repatriated. That the Beijing Film Archive would hold so many Japanese Manet titles, and that they could be found as well in Gazpromofon in Moscow, the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., the Imperial War Museum in London, comes then as no surprise to motion picture historians. So to think the Makino Collection as a vital companion to the FIAF motion picture print holdings is to see the Makino Collection as a source of, I'm borrowing Ted's term here from amateur collecting, this is another kind of shadow history, a shadow history where the prints and the actually printed material sort of follow one another. But these, most important for us, these prints in circulation and this material that explains the exhibition history tell us what we call in cinema history the life stories of motion picture prints themselves. How did they arrive there? How did this collection from Manchuria get to Moscow? It's amazing. So Professor Bao, however, reminds us, thinking about the public discourse around the moment of the release of motion pictures, that film theory traveled too, that a single translingualist like Liu Nao could leap over cultural barriers and stimulate a parallel, what she calls traffic, in international film theory. But the question for her I'd have is, yes, there is motion picture circulation, exhibition, traffic, the movement of pieces of prints, fragments then and now, and whole prints when they were, before they had begun to decompose. But do we want to parallel film theory's discourse around, or can we also see them as going in opposite directions? Professor Hughes, I want to end by referring to a portion of his paper that sort of didn't make it into the talk, but in the printed version, he ends by addressing his hopes that the Makino will serve as the site where other pre-1945 Korean, as well as other Japanese pasts, plural, can emerge. And I think of the plural pasts in relation to debates a number of us have had quite recently about what we call our Histories of Film Theory's International Translation Project. But just as we have gravitated or imagined ourselves gravitate toward the plural histories and the plural theories, we would want to think of the Makino as containing the seeds of writings not about the history of Japanese cinema, but about historical pasts, plural, about the many national cultural film legacies that pass through Japan on their way somewhere else. And that would make the secret of the Makino the very infinitude of the possible pasts for which it keeps the keys. So let's open this up to discussion. We'll have the three panelists. Well, I'll ask my hard question to Professor Bao. I always like to ask a question, a difficult question that fascinates me and to which I don't have an answer. So I'm going to ask Mai-Han, you to think about, since you know so much, having done work in the Taiwanese archives, and I love the 9.5 discovery in the Taiwanese archives. So you find this amateur work by the translator in Taiwan, but you've also done research in Beijing. And thinking of that research and how amazed you are when you find 35 millimeter prints here and there, or 9.5 millimeter. How do you think this when you start a project which is a traveling film theory project? Do you ever try to think the two together and think the metaphor of traveling is working or not working in terms of discourses and intellectual legacies, the wonderful work you're doing on stores, shops, magazines? Maybe the simple question is, do they travel in the same or different circles, the prints and the discourses in the journals?